Confession, I may have a serious spreadsheet problem. That may seem like a bit of a non sequitur for a video about shipping, but trust me, it isn't. You see, back in 2020, I started keeping track of what pairings were being tagged in fanfiction on Archive of Our Own to see what people were writing. While this began with just some totals, I then started tracking changes month to month, and by the time the hiatus ended, weekly, to get a real sense of how the fandom reacted right after an episode. Like many projects started in 2020, this could easily have been dropped, and while I'll admit I've stepped back from updating the data every week and am more backdating these every few weeks or months, I have kept it going for the past 5 years. With Campaign 3 finished and rounding out March, I think it's the perfect time to put those spreadsheets to use and figure out what exactly were the top ships for Bell's Hells. The Silver Sun, obviously. I mean, have you seen this miniature? That joke out of the way, here are my disclaimers. First up, there's a lot more to shipping than just fanfiction on AO3. I chose this because it's the easiest to quantify. I don't want to try and count all the fan art being posted everywhere. While I tried to get this data in the week right after an episode aired, this varied, and sometimes I was backtracking by a full month. The majority of the works in the fandom are one-shots, but there are ongoing fics, and tags can be added or removed after the fact, reflecting the atmosphere of the fandom later than when it was actually posted. Additionally, some of the fics I counted were deleted after the fact, and it's possible I missed fics that were deleted before I did my counts. So the numbers on here don't necessarily represent what you can actually find on the archive, although it's generally pretty close. With those disclaimers out of the way, let's take an actual look at the weekly top ships for Bell's Hells. Campaign 3 starts out strong with Laudna, everyone latching onto the ship from the pair's introduction, although as we move into the next few episodes, we see more variety. Dorian pairings are pretty dominant through the first arc, especially Orym, which quickly starts to overtake Laudna as the top ship. When Dorian departs in episode 14, we see Orym drop off, although it stays a contender. In episode 17, the reveal of Orym's late husband sparks a lot of fics, and it'll be a mainstay minor pairing for the rest of the campaign. As we leave Drusar, things get less chaotic as main ships start to develop. We see Calamore start getting more love, and entering the Bassaris arc, Imogen begins to skyrocket with the Narlruck and Dusk drama reclaiming its top position. This continues to be strong, slowly dropping off, before breaking the axis with Laudna's death in episode 34, staying high through the full resurrection arc, settling back down to normal with everyone alive. Here we see a spike for Ashton Week 2022, but other than that things are quiet as we build up to the Apogee Solstice, with Imogen and Orym as the mainstays and a mix of ships popping up here and there. With the party split, we see a rise in angst, but most notable is the introduction of love letters, with an initial burst and then its high at the end of the arc as they become a canon pairing. In Asilra, we see a spike in Orym sparked by Denise, but no major guest pairings. And, of course, a surge in Imogen as the party reunites, which then breaks the scales as the ship goes canon, entering major highs through the next few episodes. Moving into the arc with the Shattered Teeth, things have become much more settled down, only a handful of ships being written any week, with Imogen retaining the top spot. Calamore returns as the Titan shards become central, but it's Ashram Week 2023 that knocks Imogen from the number 1 spot. Through the Ruidus arc, ships have quieted down, with Imogen the only constant. There's a small spike in love letters around FCG's death, but the big fix spike comes with Dorian's return and rejoining the party. Things are again quiet as we move through the Aor arc leading into the finale, with ships being fairly settled into a few top pairings, but there's a notable spike for Orym as they confess their feelings. Imogen stays the top ship for the remainder of the campaign, however. As we move into the final episodes, we only really see Imogen, Orym, and the occasional Calamore. So, there you have it. While there's a lot of fluctuation week to week, Imogen is our number 1 ship, with Orym taking a solid and consistent second place. To get a better sense of what the top ships are, I also made a graph that looks at the totals so we can better see who's in our top 10. Again, Imogen starts out strong, Orym quickly rising to join, with a more chaotic lower tier, although definitely dominated by Dorian as the exciting new player. In the latter half of the Drusar arc, we see Orym overtake Imogen, rising to a high until Dorian leaves. Orym will gets a huge spike as he stirs the story of his dead husband, but other than that, things are mostly stable. Calamore gets a bit of a jump as we leave Drusar, but entering the Bassaris arc post-EXU Calamity is when Imogen overtakes Orym, really skyrocketing with episode 34 and Laudna's death and resurrection arc. Things are pretty constant through here to the solstice, but we see Calamore inch up. Other than that, things are constant until the party split, where at the end of the Wild Mount arc, Love Letters jumps up to join the top 10. At the end of the Asilra arc, Imogen gets another huge jump, and by episode 64 there's double the fic as Orym as the ship goes canon. We start to see Fearne Imogen join the top 10. While never a major ship, it's consistent enough to start knocking out the Het Dorian ships with his departure, helped by being a common side pairing to Imogen with the Witches Be Bitches OT3, but also a solo pair as the 2 Ruidus born. There's a jump in Calamore through the Titan Shard arc, but not enough to come close to Orym Will just yet. At the start of the Ruidus arc, we see Laudna break 1500, being the one ship that really constantly grows as the others are more intermittent. Again, a small increase in love letters with FCG's death, and a decent jump in Dorym as the Crown Keepers return and he rejoins the party. With Air, we don't see anything from Braius' introduction, and our top ships are again pretty constant, although Chetney Fearne finally manages to beat out Imogen and Dorian for a top 10 seat. As we move to the final arc, Calamore is finally able to inch out Orym and Will, although the two will stay neck and neck with each other. By the finale, we see Laudna break 2000, but there's no real spike for anything for the final episodes or in response to the wrap-up. So there we have our top 10 ships. Laudna wasn't always the number 1 ship, but it has been there since the start, with Dorym solidly at number 2 and Ashton later but still steady 3rd place. Calamore has a much slower rise, joining the top 10 in episode 17 and the top 5 with the Solstice, but narrowly managed to beat out Orym Will for number 4 by the finale. Ashton Dorian has been a constant runner-up, but never memorable, and in large part helped out as the leg of the OT3 with Dorym and Ashton. Aside from Laudna Dorian and number 9, the rest of our top 10 are all late additions that slowly grew to replace the early leaders from the Drusar arc. Love Letters in number 7 is the biggest guest ship, excluding Dorian, of course. Fearne Imogen in number 8, and Chetney Fearne in number 10, the only Chetney ship to make it into any of the top 10 status. The top 10 ships are interesting, but it's hard to really look at the shipping with characters like Chetney or FCG when it's so dominated by these big OTPs. So if you really want to look at this data, let's filter it out by character to see more of those nitty-gritty patterns. Going in table order, we'll start off with Chetney. Not joining the party until episode 7, we see some initial flirting with Fearne and a few fics after they don't sleep together in episode 16. This quiets down but starts up again in the late Bassaris arc and with the Gorgini. By the time we reach the party split, Deanna joins as his ex, and she and Fearne both get pairings as they have the canon threesome, but nothing huge. Chetney has a wider range for ships for the following months, including Orym's mother as that becomes a running joke, but quiets down once more through the Ruidus arc, with a few returns to the Deanna-Fearne threesome. We also see Ashton Fearne as a threesome introduced, as well as the last hurrah with Deanna before the final battle, but nothing for the finale itself for the wrap-up. This isn't a super exciting graph. There's a reason I added in the poly ships so that there'd be a bit more to look at, but even then there's only a handful of weeks where there were multiple fics tagging a Chetney ship at all, much less the same ship. Fearne and Deanna are definitely the big pairings here, but it's pretty small and there aren't a lot of patterns. Laudna is a bit more interesting, but is very dominated by Imogen. Dorian is a recurring secondary ship through the early Drusar arc, but falls off with his departure, replaced by the occasional Ashton fic. EXU Calamity is the only time Laudna hits 0, jumping back up with the Bassaris arc, with some Dusk fic, and the Axis break that is Laudna's death and resurrection. We see more Ashton here, but still very small in comparison to the Laudna. Continuing on as they travel to Eos, things are quiet, but some spikes leading into the Solstice, dropping low with the characters separated in the aftermath. With the parties reunited, Laudna gets their first kiss, and once again we break the Axis several times. After this, our minor ships go to basically 0, with only the occasional non-Laudna fic, as Laudna itself oscillates both in response to the episodes, but also general phases of fandom activity and events. We see some Dusk, but after this point, the only ship of note is Fearne, as the Witches Be Bitches OT3. There is a spike for the final battle, but not one that breaks the Axis, instead just the general range Laudna has consistently been at. That isn't surprising, as there generally wasn't a spike for the finale for Campaign 3, and there weren't any big surprises for the ship. Dorian goes here because this is where he sits, and we'll actually start a few months earlier with EXU since that's where his story really begins. From the start, we see Doriax as the top ship, peaking with episode 4 and gradually falling off post-EXU. There is some Dorym before Campaign 3, but that's where it truly becomes the big ship, although there's a plentiful mix of Ashton, Imogen, Laudna, and Fearne as well. Everything other than Dorym falls off as Dorian leaves, although they'll linger through the Bassaris arc, while Dorym falls but still stays consistently written, getting a peak with the Sending Stone message being returned, and then again with Orym's death. Dorym gradually decreases as we move through Laudna's resurrection and the Apogee Solstice, and other ships fall even further, but there's a huge spike in Asilra, along with some Doriax, as Denise is introduced and we scry on the Crown Keepers. This doesn't last long, and Dorym falls down to 0, but still above the intermittent Ashton and other fics. It stays low through the Ruidus arc, but rises as the Crown Keepers return and he rejoins the party, although no other fics get the same treatment. We see one final spike with the kiss as they become canon, and then more of the same general aura with every other ship being pretty much absent. There's no real spike with the finale, but Dorym stays above 0 until the end. So, mostly dominated by Dorym, but we do see Doriax from EXU, even if it doesn't have much staying power, and the tangle of ships in early Campaign 3, as everyone was excited by the new party member that gradually fade away into basically just Ashton. Fresh cut grass is going to be another empty one, though the Drusar arc we see some fairly consistent Ashton Fics as the starting duo like a Laudna. This falls off pretty quickly as Belle's Hells leave the city, with a dearth of any shippy fresh cut grass Fics at all, even with NPCs as we move through Calamity. There's a brief resurgence in the end of Bassaris, again mainly with Ashton, but a few others sprinkled in. It's still generally quiet. After the solstice, Frida gets a gradual build with their introduction, and then gets to break our tiny axis as Love Letters goes canon, but remains a very intermittent ship, falling off as Christian leaves the table, only the occasional fic after. There's a small jump around episode 91 and FCG's death, but again only singular fics, and after that things are pretty quiet, with only one more Love Letters fic and nothing for any other pairing for the latter part of the campaign. Without Frida, this would be a pretty empty graph, but while it never caught on to have consistent writing, Love Letters left a mark, enough to make it into the top 10. Ashton is the only other pairing worth noting, but is definitely one that fell off in the first year of Campaign 3. With Fearne, we're also starting out with EXU, and here we see a strong start with Opal as the femme/ship of the Crown Keepers, some Orym as well. Entering Campaign 3 proper, things are more chaotic, with a decent amount of Dorian and Orym as the starting group OT3. Once we leave Drusar, Ashton starts coming more common, and Dorian trails off, but this drops back down through the Bassaris arc, where there's a more general mix, with a stronger showing of Chetney during the Gorgine plot. Following the solstice, we see some Imogen, even with Ashton, and then things are quiet. Calomore picks up again through the Shattered Teeth and jumping with everything around the Titan Shards. Ashton remains the top pairing from here on, but we see more Imogen as a secondary pairing, as well as still the occasional Chetney, Laudna, and Dorian. Calomore is intermittent and doesn't take any particular spike for the finale. Unlike Chetney and FCG, there's no shortage of ships here, but even with Calomore, nothing super dominates. Because she's shipped with pretty much everyone, Fearne is spread in a lot of directions, and the result is kind of messy. The Titan Shards definitely solidified Calomore as the top pairing, and we see the others have emptied out through the late campaign, but even then, it's never groundbreaking. With Imogen, once again, Imogen is king. Similar to Laudna, Dorian is an early pairing, and we also have a few Orym and Fearne fics, but both fall off as we leave Drusar, nothing else taking the place. Imogen hits 0 for the only time at the end of EXU Calamity, but then jumps up with the Bassaris arc and drama. There's not as much Dusk fic with Imogen as Laudna, but we're still breaking the barrier with Laudna's death and resurrection. In the aftermath, things quiet down, but moving towards the solstice, we see a small spike in Beau ships as she joins up with Belle's Hells, as well as Fearne and Imogen as they're in Wildmount together. With the parties reunited, Imogen becomes canon, and we once again break the barrier several times. From here, we see only the occasional fic, some Beau, some Fearne, and also a lot of Imogen Odahan, a ship that started around the solstice and is a fairly consistent background, even if it will never be a mainstay. A bit more active than compared to Laudna, but still only minor pairings and paling in comparison to any ship that isn't Imogen. Orym starts out small with EXU. There's some Fearne and Dorian fic, but not much, only really kicking off with Campaign 3 proper, where Dorian jumps to number 1, and we add in Ashton to the mix as Fearne slowly falls off as we leave Drusar. Will is hinted at, and then gets a huge peak when fully revealed in episode 17, then a background pairing tied with Dorian and Ashton. With Orym's death, there's another Will and Dorian peak, and a bit later we see Ashton peak with Ashton Week 2022, not anything in universe. Again, these three even out, but after the solstice, Dorian gets a jump with Denise and the scrying. The next arc is more dominated by Ashram, both Dorian and Will falling pretty low without much content. This is highest for Ashram Week 2023, and then everything gets low through the Ruidus arc. But in episode 93, the Crown Keepers return, and Dorian returns to full force. There's a small Braius peak with his introduction, but it doesn't have any lasting impact, and Dorian continues to hold strong, peaking again as they have their first kiss. We have one last Ashram peak for Ship Week 2024, but for the final arc, the main focus is definitely on Dorian. So while early on we have some Fearne, really Orym is in an even heat between Dorian, Ashton, and his late husband. Dorian is strongest at the start and at the end, but has a notable high point for episode 59, while Ashton mostly peaks in response to ship weeks and not canon. Ashton is a pretty messy one through the start of the Drusar arc, a mix of Dorian, Orym, and FCG, with some Milo in there as well. Leaving Drusar, we see it become Ashram and Calomore dominated, although not that much above Dorian. Fearne falls to the wayside in Bassaris, while Orym stays strong. There's a general peak following the near TPK, and then Orym breaks the axis with Ashram Week 2022. There's some notable Laudna through this era, but still independent peaks. Following the solstice, Calomore picks up again, and while not as consistent as Ashram through this era, it does pick up through the Shattered Teeth and beats it out for episode 77. And then Ashram Week 2023 crushes things. After this, Calomore is the more dominant ship, although still neck and neck. Ashram stays above consistent background pair Dorian, and does get a non-axis breaking peak for Ashram Week 2024. There's not much for the final arc, no peak for Callamore, and no ship fix at all following the wrap-up. Overall, it's really a dance between Orym and Fearne, trading blows, and while Orym is generally higher, that's mostly around the ship weeks. Taking those out would even the playing field a lot. Dorian is a solid third, but we also see Laudna, Milo, and for the early arc, Fresh Cut Grass. Last, and unfortunately least, we have Braius Doomseed. Because he was introduced so late in the campaign, there isn't much to see, so we'll speed through. Following episode 98, there's an initial large Orym peak, but it never gets carried through, and what's left is only a handful of other fics. Some Orym, some Dorian, some Fearne Ashton OT3, and one with Tevin Clask, but even with 20 episodes and his best attempts at flirting, Braius doesn't manage to make much of an impact on the fandom. So there we have it, an in-depth look at the top ships for every member of Bell's Hells. With all those random one-offs, it's hard to compare, so we should see the totals. I could do another set of top 10 bar graphs, but for all the characters, I think it makes more sense to compare the proportions, so let's get some pie. Again, starting with EXU, we see Doriax and Fearne Opal dominate, while Orym is pretty split between Dorian, Fearne, and miscellaneous ships. These stay solid through the end. With Campaign 3, we see Laudna immediately dominate, and Orym quickly take a hold, first with Orym then Dorian, while Ashton and Fearne are more mixed. FCG is very strongly just Ashton, while Chetney takes a long while to get anyone but Fearne. These stay pretty true, with our top ships only getting more of a share, and things stay pretty stable. Our first major upset comes in the form of Love Letters, which quickly grows to dominate FCG's ships. Other than that, things stay even up through the end, and the subtle shifts don't really impact the general proportions. While Imogen and Laudna are both each other's strong majority, we see that Imogen has more other ships than Laudna does, albeit not by much. Orym also claims a majority for both Dorian and Orym, but while Dorian it's 3/4, for Orym it's only half, as Ashton takes up a quarter and Will almost takes up another. FCG and Chetney have much smaller values, but have Frida and Fearne take up over half as well. Fearne is about half Callamore, but has the most even split of the remainder, with only FCG being less than the other slices. Ashton is the only character who doesn't have a majority, although Orym is very close to half, it doesn't quite reach there. Callamore takes up a third. Ashton also has the highest amount of other ships, although Chetney has a larger proportion due to these smaller overall sizes. Still, this shows us exactly how dominant these big OTPs are, and who gets the most evenly shipped out of the whole bunch. But I wasn't just tracking romantic pairings, I was also tracking platonic pairings, that is, anything that uses an ampersand instead of a slash. The usage of this varies, from friendship focus to any major non-romantic relationship to a sign they start as friends and end up lovers. There's also plenty of friendship fics that don't have any tags at all. Again, not a lot of quantitative data on this stuff, so we'll stick with what we've got. This chart is a calculation of how platonic versus romantic or sexual a ship is, taking the number of slash ship tags divided by the number of and tags. That means that any value greater than 1 is romantic, colored pink here, while any value less than 1 is more platonic, colored blue. The closer something is to 1, the more back and forth people are. The black squares are where there wasn't at least one tag for both the slash and the ampersand pairing. I thought about animating this, where it changed week to week, but that was a lot of work, so I did it for every 10 weeks, because that was much more manageable. The first big changes are just filling things in and getting settled, but we see Callamore and the Dorian, Laudna, Orym, and Ashton ships are the most romantic. Imogen is being held back by the friendship and pre-ship dynamic. FCG, Chetney, and Orym with the girls have a lot of friend fics, while Fearne is generally the one who's the most in the middle. By the end, we see that Callamore is the most romantic ship, followed by Dorian Laudna, Orym, Ashton Dorian, then Laudna. Dorian Laudna was able to hold on to the lead with very few friend fics, while Imogen slowly grew along with the pairing. For our most platonic, Orym and Laudna take it by a landslide, then FCG with Orym, Ashton, Chetney, and Laudna. FCG is the only one to be full blue. For the most in-the-middle ships, while no one stayed a perfect even 1-to-1, we see that Dorian Imogen is the most even, then Fearne with Imogen, Laudna, Dorian, and FCG, with Fearne really being the one with the most balance between platonic and romantic tags, aside from Callamore as the top ship. I thought about doing line graphs for the and tags, but honestly these are much more intermittent, and only Imogen and Laudna and Orym and Ashton have consistent uses, mostly reflecting back on ship tags. So that's all I have to talk about for the ship tags in general. There's already so much in this video that I don't want to get into Campaign 1 and Campaign 2, but as probably won't surprise you, all those characters and ships are still getting plenty of content, and not just because of Legend of Vox Machina and the crossovers in Campaign 3. So while I won't break down the individual ships, I will show you the tracking of how many total fics fall into each campaign. Starting at the very beginning, it's not until the Briarwoods arc we start seeing fic for Campaign 1. As you'd expect, basically all the fic we see is for Vox Machina, but there are a small handful of one-shot fics. Campaign 1 peaks with the end of the Chroma Conclave arc, and then settles into the steady rate it'll keep for the next several years. Campaign 2 quickly rises up, becoming 80 to 90% of the total fic, and most of the shape is determined by Campaign 2, while Campaign 1 stays constant. The lowest that we get outside that first month is the end of the pandemic hiatus, and the highest is the finale. Counting EXU as part of Campaign 3, we see a gradual rise, but it stays below the levels of Campaign 2 until Laudna's death and resurrection. With the introduction of Legend of Vox Machina, we see an increase in Campaign 1, and the three campaigns are pretty neck and neck, although Campaign 2 is generally the highest and Campaign 1 generally the lowest. Vox Machina peaks with Legend of Vox Machina Season 1, the visit to Whitestone in Campaign 3, Vax's return in the Amphigy Solstice lining up with Season 2 to hit that #1 spot, then again when Legend of Vox Machina Season 3 lines up with Vox Machina's return as player characters. With the Mighty Nine, the highs don't quite line up for the early part of Campaign 3, instead more often peaking in October for monthly fic challenges, but we do see some peaks with Essex appearance in Aor, and for when the Mighty Nine show up. Aside from Laudna, the biggest highs for Bell's Hells are the start of the campaign and when the parties are reunited following the solstice, but otherwise it's fairly even until the end. While we do see a significant downward trend from 2023 onwards, this is mostly the result of Campaign 2's general slow decline, although all three campaigns see low values as we go into the hiatus. This is still over 100 fics per month, and without an influx of new content, a sign things are still going strong. I'm excited to see how these stats change as we get some distance from the end of Campaign 3, especially moving into whatever comes next. Whether people continue to write for these endgame pairings or branch out more, and how we see these proportions change as the Mighty Nine start to get their own animated series. As is maybe obvious, there's a lot more analysis that could be done, but I think this is a good overview to summarize Campaign 3. If you're interested, I've got links in the description to all the charts in this video for you to play around with, as well as many, many more from my older work doing ship stats. But if you've got specific questions about these data, let me know in the comments, because the more I use it, the less I have to question how much time I spent collecting it. It was definitely a normal and reasonable amount of time.